Hello, dear listener, and welcome to attempt 2 of this video. I'm trying to keep my voice at a normal volume, even though it's a lot later than I usually record. So, I know this is a little bit different than how my content has been recently. Instead of playing a video game, I'm sitting down and we're having a chat about some troll gender, some troll social stuff. And this will, as far as I have planned, be accompanied by some sort of speed paint, because I couldn't think of what else to do, and I don't like having my face on camera. And as you may have assumed from what I just said, this is kind of a theory, headcanon, idea discussion, basically. I guess currently an essay could be a discussion if you'd like to join in the comments, say what you think. Because coming from my perspective, I think that it is infinitely more realistic and, well, not infinitely, it is more realistic and more interesting to consider that troll gender is not divided on the binary system that we have, and is instead a much more caste-focused bubble system. As a forewarning, this is coming from the perspective of a non-binary person with an interesting relationship to my gender and my identity also as lesbian. I'm a non-binary lesbian, if you didn't know. And two, obviously I'm going to be talking about gender. I'm going to be talking about some troll reproduction stuff, nothing any more explicit than is in canon, but I will be talking about troll reproduction throughout the video. I'm also going to talk about, I might brush over some stuff like gender dysphoria, homestuck spoilers, stuff about the ancestors, and all sorts of fun. The caste system, if, talking about the caste system, maybe makes you uncomfortable for whatever reason. Just to kind of lay that groundwork for you. And again, my thesis statement is, I think troll gender is more complicated than what we've seen and explored so far in canon. And I think to start, let's talk for a second about the human gender binary with quotes around it, because and troll reproduction cycle. So the, at least Western understanding, I'm not going to claim understanding of other stuff because I know it's complicated and societal, at least the Western understanding of a gender binary comes from the two extremes of sexual anatomy. You know what those are. That would then go on to contribute to the production of a child. Now, trolls don't do that. Trolls, at least as far as we are aware, reproduce in a hive system. So trolls don't reproduce with each other. They have their quadrant in pails. They send them off to the mother grove. The mother grove lays the eggs. You know about this. It is possible to deduce, and some people have in fact deduced this as a common fanon over the years, that because of references to things like bulges and nooks, that trolls either did possess at one point the ability to reproduce amongst themselves personally, or still have the ability but are either unaware of or just dissuaded, I think is the word, from doing it. So for societal control reasons, probably dog scratches like that, the inverse is like that, you know how it is. Which I think which is my theory within this larger theory of why maybe trolls have the ideas of girls and boys, is because there may have been a very similar development, but then they either moved on to mass reproduction, or the focus shifted away from personal reproduction, or they lost, they use the mother grove now, basically. And obviously that doesn't, gender is an infinite expanse and you can do whatever you want with it, but these words do seem to exist in the troll lexicon, so that is kind of the assumption that I'm making behind, is that for one reason or another, these ideas of extremes were introduced to alternian society, although they no longer have the same meaning. And part of what I mean by that is that, obviously, like I said, trolls don't reproduce individually, and what they do have is sharp social divides along caste lines. Assumptions are made along these caste lines. People's jobs, their personalities, their ideas, their thoughts, and then perceived intelligence levels are drawn across caste lines. And because of the architectural and societal, and probably maybe not financial, it's never really talked about like how trolls make money, but those divides also make it so neighborhoods tend to be concentrated around 1 to 3 blood colors in a given space, with higher spaces tending to be reserved for blood colors more specifically, which is to say there's a lot of rusts and bronze bloods in San Francisco's neighborhood, and you have to then walk out of the neighborhood to see any of the other ones. And that seems like teals and ceruleans live relatively close together. Jades obviously live in the caverns, but jades we'll talk about. Jades are a weird exception to basically everything. And then you have like specifically indigo neighborhoods and specifically purple neighborhoods, and obviously violets live in the ocean amongst themselves. And so some quick check-ins with the wikis. According to the wiki, it has been cited that blues, indigos, and purples are considered generally male-dominated, while jades are almost exclusively female. Quotations around both of those. But I think it's a couple things I have with these statements. One is that they are very cis-sexist, I think would be the word. If it's not, my bad. What I mean is it runs on the assumption that there are only these two genders, and that especially because we have seen correlations between the cooler castes and strength, I think that's kind of whack. And of course the whole motherhood thing with the jades, I guess we'll talk about the jades. But there's a couple things. Like I said, Hussey is, as far as I know, a cis man, and so his ideas of gender may not be as expansive. I don't know his life, but sometimes the things he says seem to imply that. Also, both of these claims, at least in the wiki, were sourced from the Ancestor games. And I know for a fact the Jades are almost exclusively female bit was quoted from Forum, and it seemed like the cooler caste being generally male-dominated comes from, I think, Irania. I glanced at the source material, but then Irania was the games, and the thing with that is if these are statements that come from the Ancestors, I think they're very weak in analyzing alternian society, because one, the Ancestors are from before us, not Alternia, and we know even from the very basic interaction to get that Alternia and before us have very different social systems and very different ideas of what the castes mean. And also, the Ancestors seem to be very poor examples of beforean society because of their position as largely just being ways for Hussey to make fun of social groups. You've read Homestuck. You know what I'm talking about. At least I'm presuming you've read Homestuck. And also, as an interesting side note, ceruleans were included in that in the claim that these castes are generally male-dominated, but we have only ever seen one boy cerulean to date, and that's Malik. All of the ceruleans we've seen have been female, or girls, and Frisk is behind that. I just know it. But then that also starts breaking down their arguments. So I'm putting that statement in the garbage, and we'll come back to Jades. And so actually, let's get back to Jades real quick. So in general, I'll talk about castes in general in a second, but as a specific note, I want to note that the Jades, Teals, and Purple castes seem to be much more isolated from other castes than each other. Not for personal reasons, which Indigos seem to be more isolated for personal reasons instead of societal reasons, but for societal reasons, Jades, Teals, and Purples tend to stick within their castes, which I will get back to. I'm getting back to this is one big circle of stupidity, basically, except I'm just talking about gender. I remember now. I had to go look at my reference documents to see what I wanted to talk about next. So about those caste systems and how they tend to be isolated either with or from each other. And I want to also touch on how lifespans factor this as well. And the first thing is that going by what we see in Friendsim, the neighborhoods tend to be very isolated from each other. Neighborhoods tend to be 1 to 3 blood colors at the most. Like Zephyros and Damek live very close to each other. We see Demian and I don't know his name, but Plain Boy seem to be pretty close together. These bronze bloods and rust bloods tend to be grouped together in a lot of places. So I think those two would have a completely different societal context from which they come from. Gold bloods are in a weird pocket too. They seem to hang out with other people more. They have a completely different expectation stuff set out for them. And then you have, going up, you have the Jades, which all live in the caverns. Get to that again. There's teal neighborhoods, and then you start seeing cerulean neighborhoods and indigo neighborhoods. And we don't really go to purple neighborhoods in Friendsim, but considering that they don't seem to live anywhere else, I have to imagine they have them. And so what I think these do is create those gender bubbles. I think I mentioned them as gender bubbles. Because basically, we always, we as humans, our gender is very deeply influenced by the culture that we grow up in. Obviously, it is an innate sense. There is a sense of self that exists within you, but how you express that and how you label that is affected. It doesn't tend to be. It is affected by the society in which you grow up, in the culture in which you grow up. So in the case of Alternia, you have these very, especially when trolls are younger, they obviously branch out, and we've seen quadrant pairs across all sorts of caste lines, but those aren't foundational. Those aren't, the trolls you build your hive next to. That's not the people in your hive stem. That's, and the people in your neighborhood or your hive stem or, the caverns are the people who are going to ultimately influence how you identify it. So I think there'd be a lot more closeness between, the bronzes and the rust bloods and the golds, and you have like the olives and the teal. Everybody has their own little gender bubbles. And I honestly think part of the reason why we may see more strong expressions, if that makes sense, like much more outspoken and strong impressions of gender in cooler castes and the higher castes, is because they both have the societal room to breathe because they're not as worried about their day-to-day survival, and the lifespan. They can take their time and think about the words that they might like to use for their self-identification, because they're not gonna die at the age of 40. So nevertheless, I think a lot of the lower castes are kind of more lax about it. I will say that all two of the canon non-binary trolls we've seen one of them was a gold and one of them was olive. So I'm calling them canon because they use they them pronouns. But speaking of pronouns, that's the other interesting thing about alternate society, is along with the caste divides, there is a heavy emphasis on self-expression. There is not as much dimorphism as among the trolls, especially some of the more recent ones. A lot of what set trolls apart from each other and what gives them their sense of presentation is self-expression. And, you look at Tyzeus and you know what she's about. You know what she's up to. You look at Stelson, you know what she's up to. You look at Skyla and you're like, that's a cowboy. That's a cowboy, baby. And they dress for their own personal situation and their own personal comfort. Tagora dresses like that. He's got a mullet and a man bun. Because he's allowed to do that. And, these expressions and body types, and you could come at me with like, oh, but trolls don't do fashion. I think kind of in the similar vein to the ancestors, it is a little bit hard to get any sort of deep brain analysis from the original 12 trolls because of a lot of reasons. But what we've seen in troll content since is that self-expression seems to be very important to trolls and gets more elaborate as you go up the caste system as well. And so you have stuff like, Zephyros has 17 of the same shirt, whereas, Galax seems to have a whole closet to himself, even if it's all the same shirt. He still could have a closet if he really wanted to. And, the assumption is never made of ability or, what's that called? Ability or skill level or anything like that. It's never seemed to be based on lines of the self-expression. As I mentioned in my first attempt at that, my cat ruined, Tagora, I used Tagora as an example, seems to be the kind of person who would use any chance he has to get a leg up in his chosen career. Now, he's directly opposed to Theseus. They're going for, if I remember correctly, they are going for the same kind of career. And he takes a bunch of jabs at her, but he never brings her self-expression into it. Except, I think she might call him pretentious. I can't remember. And then also on the flip side of that, because Alternia does appear to be a matriarchy, there's also no assumption that Theseus is going to be inherently better, or that Stelsa is inherently better than Tagora or Tagiri, or vice versa. Presentation does not seem to have presentation, and the language requested, I'm specifying that right now, does not seem to be something that is perceived as an indication of someone's success. It is caste that defines that viewpoint. And with that out of the way, I also want to talk a little bit. Let's go back to self-expression real quick. Let's go back to self-expression, because I want to do specifically, also returning, is the fact that every Jade we've seen but one has been presumably and presenting feminine, assumed to be girls, except for Link, who is, by word of God, distinctly a trans man. And so what I think this is that all Jades are what we would be considered to be assigned female at birth. Trolls don't have a reason to have that. They don't need to do that. And so what I think it is, specifically for Jades, and kind of a similar reason for the cooler bloods, is that Jades have a very small population and a very close-knit population and a very isolated population. And what that ends up being for Jades is that they have a quote-unquote low genetic diversity of gender. There are a lot of expectations placed on Jades. There are a lot of things that there are a lot of assumptions that are made about Jades, even more so than some of the other castes, to perform these very specific roles and very specific forms of self-expression. And so I think it's just that they present that way because that's just what everyone does. It's just kind of assumed. And then they don't really have as many new ideas introduced, but they're also kind of leading into what some of the higher bloods have, which is more time to reflect on a very unique Jade culture and go, okay, well, this is what we've always done. And you may be wondering, okay, then how can Link, and you may be wondering, okay, oh boy, you mentioned earlier that trolls don't really have sexual dimorphism. Or you don't think that trolls have sexual dimorphism. So how trans? And I think in the context of this society where gender is a much more loose concept and a much more caste-defined concept, I think that for trolls, they can essentially figure out an original gender for themselves as young grubs, and obviously everyone's perception of their gender changes as they get older. I think it is a much more personal label than it is, because, in our current human society, we are all assigned genders at birth, and then, well, most of us are, and then to shift away from that then becomes then you're trans. And I think in the context of a society where things are very bendy, I think it's a very personal label, and that it implies just a very radical change. So a troll who maybe adjusts slight parts of their presentation might not define themselves as trans, but someone like who was maybe born into this very jade centered culture and then saw, maybe read about, or even just, maybe he met a teal one day and he was like, I want to do that actually. And so there was a very dramatic shift in the way he presented himself and the way that he looked. And maybe he had, the thing is we don't really know a lot about and he's not a great example, but maybe he changed his name, went through a big change in language he used to refer to himself, name change, presentation change, and so that even without necessarily changing anything on the level that we would consider like HRT or surgeries, he has now transitioned to a completely new form of gender. And sorry, I had to take a break, just look over my papers again. So what I'm not saying is that trolls have a binary system. What I am saying is that cis and trans are much more loose ideas in troll society, and that from a human perspective, all trolls are non-binary, and for all, I honestly think this kind of comes down to the Homestuck team, and I don't know the team very well. For one reason or another, they really haven't introduced any trolls who use more explicitly neutral pronouns in English, but are not vaguely androgynous, vaguely masculine, which I think they should. Imagine I've got a knife emoji. I heard you the first time, to give us. And then also, there haven't really been any trolls with conflicting presentation with the language that they use to refer to themselves. But even then, I think the language is, pronouns are an indicator of gender. They are a form of self-expression. If you didn't know. So a troll could be, and actually in this case, Sarava could even be considered quote unquote cis, but still use neutral pronouns because that's just how they've always been and how they've always felt comfortable. And I mentioned the Empress, and I want to circle back around to the Empress. And I think we don't know enough, I think, about Sea Dwellers. I haven't played Act 2 yet, so don't tell me. To really make deductions based on their gender. But what I will say is I honestly think in the context of a caste-based gender system, it is not actually that every fuchsia that has been born in recent memory has been a girl. That the Empress has been in power, and the language that she uses to refer to herself, the pronouns girl, Empress, all that fun stuff, is then applied to all future fuchsias as sort of a mark of like a noble title, I heard you. That these pronouns and ideas are then associated with being fuchsia, and because no one has taken the Empress down, there has not been a shift in assigned hereditary pronouns. And so if Trizza had shown up in space one day, beat the Empress, and decided, actually, I'm an emperor and I want to use they, he pronouns, then that would have been then assigned to all fuchsias afterwards until someone came and took over. Or with any, potential fuchsia who would go to fight her imperious condescension. Sorry, my cat is being an asshole. And then also Karkat. I think Karkat his gender is lonely because he has no cat. That sounds like a joke, but genuinely, I think there's something to be said about the fact that that maybe he even presents very masculine because he is without caste guidance because he's the only one of his caste. And give me a second. And that, the only other example of someone of Kirkette's cast is also, you know, at least somewhat masculine, used he, him pronouns, and was a little bit angry. So I think that's just kind of the mantle that Kirkette adopted for himself. And that's all the thoughts I have for now. I may come make a follow-up for this later if I rewatch this and then decide that I have some more stuff I want to add. And then also, as a fun bonus, I've been talking a lot about troll gender and then not addressed really the terms, except for vaguely alluding to the fact that trolls still seem to use girl and boy. And that is, I think, what we, as a fandom, actually, that sounds weird. What I have seen is that people are not taking near enough advantage of the fact that trolls love to make things overcomplicated, because I think there is so much more interesting potential in troll genders that are like a sentence, like a movie title. You know, like they're you know, movie titles are basically the whole plot. Why can't troll genders be entire aesthetics? Like, honestly, here's a fun end video bonus. I'm going to read for you the sentence I wrote on my original document about this, which was non-binary lesbian Kanaya, whose gender is vampire in a castle on a hill, who always seems to be wearing a dress with a phoenix so low it's almost a jacket, and who languishes in deceptive comfort until a beautiful woman stumbles onto her doorstep in the middle of a terrible rainstorm, where she invites inside and subtly courts with her lavish lifestyle till the visitor ultimately figures out her host is a vampire, in parentheses, and then they gay kiss. Thanks for listening. Sorry my cat interrupted. Sorry if I was ever really rambly. Like I said, I'm going to, or I might, you know, one day maybe come back with a slightly more scripted version of this video, or to clarify some of my points. If you do listen to this video, feel free to leave stuff in the comments, you know. If you have any other thoughts, if you just want to be transphobic, just don't bother, I guess. Non-binary identities are valid. Don't come at me with that bullshit. I am non-binary, so, but, you know, if you just want to have a discussion about troll genders, I'm always down for that. I will see you in my Pester Quest Let's Play, because that's what's coming out soon. So I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye!